A motorcycle went down on wet asphalt at the bottom of the grade, and the sound of it carried farther than the rain. Metal screamed against the road. The rider hit shoulder first and slid maybe 15 feet before a guardrail caught him and stopped him cold. Rain came down in sheets, hammering the back of his jacket, drumming on the cooling engine of the bike that lay on its side behind him with the front wheel still turning slow in the dark. He did not move at first. The road steamed where it was warm and ran with black water where it was not. Then he pushed himself up onto one arm, and a thin line of blood ran down his elbow and mixed with the rainwater on the road and disappeared into the runoff like it had never been there. He got his legs under him by inches. He limped to the bike and grabbed the handlebars with both hands and tried to lift it, and his arms gave out, and he went down to one knee in the gravel at the edge of the shoulder, breathing hard, the rain running off his chin. Headlights from the new highway up on the ridge swept over the tops of the trees far away the way headlights do when there is a whole valley between you and them. But nobody came down the grade. Nobody slowed. The road he had taken that curve on Route 9 ran along the bottom of a holler in the western mountains of North Carolina, and after dark it carried nothing at all but wind and water and the occasional deer. Then a light came on inside a small garage set back off the road behind a gravel lot with weeds growing up green through the cracks. A door opened, throwing a yellow rectangle out across the wet stones, and an old woman stepped out into the rain. Her name was Hattie Monroe. What happened between these two strangers over the next 6 hours and over the weeks that followed would bring a whole county to a standstill before the leaves turned. Stay with me on this one because it is the kind of story that does not come along often, and it is worth every minute you give it. Hattie Monroe had been turning wrenches in that building for the better part of 50 years. Same garage, same cracked concrete floor she swept clean every single morning, whether anybody was coming or not. Same tin roof that leaked in 3 spots when the rain came down hard, with a dented coffee can set under the worst of them to catch the drip, a sound she had grown so used to that the silence when it stopped felt louder than the dripping ever had. She and her husband had built that place with their own 4 hands back, when the road still carried real traffic, back when haulers and bikers and men running parts down to the city rolled through every weekend looking for fuel and a sandwich, and somebody who actually knew how to fix a thing instead of just yanking it out and bolting in a new one. Her husband's name was Gage. He had been gone 11 years now. He died in the spring, the way he would have chosen if anybody had thought to ask him, with grease worked into the creases of his knuckles and a customer's transmission half out of the car and the radio playing low in the corner. Hattie had found him on the stool by the lift when she came out with his coffee. She had set the coffee down on the bench so it would not spill, because some part of her was already a widow before the rest of her caught up, and a widow does not waste coffee. She had kept the doors of that garage open every day since because she did not know how to do anything else with her hands or her hours, and because closing them even for a week felt like burying the man a second time. That was a long time ago, the traffic. The state ran a new 4-lane through the next valley wall over back in the 90s and took the cars with it all in one season, the way a river will change its course in a flood and never come back to the old bed. Just like that, the road out front went from a route to a memory. What was left dried up year by year, customer by customer, until Monroe's garage became the kind of place people only mentioned when they were giving directions to somewhere else. Turn left where the old shop is. Go on past the old garage and you will see the church. That was her landmark now, a place nobody stopped at that helped folks find the places they were actually going. Hattie did not feel sorry for herself. That had never once been her way, not in 71 years, and she was not about to take it up now. She opened the bay doors every morning at 6. She swept the floor. She lined her wrenches up on the pegboard by size smallest to largest, the way Gage had taught her, and the way his own father had taught him, because a man who cannot find his tools is a man who has already lost the argument with the machine. Then she waited. Some days a truck pulled in off the new highway, having missed a turn with a dead battery, or a slipping belt, or a noise the driver could not name, and she fixed it and charged him fare and watched him drive off, grateful. Most days nothing came at all but the wind through the open bay and the sound of the creek behind the building running high and brown in the spring and low and clear in the fall, marking the turn of the year for her, the way a clock marks the turn of an hour. She had a little money put by. Not much. There was Gage's small pension and her own from the years she had kept the books at the lumber mill before it shut its gates, and between the two of them and the rare paying customer, she could keep the lights burning and food on the table if she was careful. And Hattie Monroe had been careful her entire life. She had two grandchildren out in Oregon she talked to on the telephone on Sunday evenings when the calls went through. The signal down in the holler being what it was. She had a son out there she loved more than her own next breath, who had moved west years ago to be near the kind of work that pays a man enough to raise a family, and a daughter-in-law with a kind face who mailed her photographs and drew little hearts on the backs of them. They asked her every Christmas to come and live with them, and every Christmas she gave them the same answer she gave the cold and the quiet and the empty road. There is the shop. Somebody has got to mind the shop. She knew it was not much of a reason. She also knew it was the only one she had, and that a person who lets go of the last reason they have got is a person who has let go of more than a reason. Her days had a shape to them, and the shape was the thing that held her together when nothing else would. She rose before the light every morning, summer and winter, both because a body that has worked for 60 years does not learn to lie in bed just because there is no longer anyone to rise for. She made the coffee in the dented percolator on the stove, and she fried her eggs, and she ate them, standing at the window looking out at the lot and the road and the wall of dark trees across it. She read a chapter of the Bible at the table because Gage's mother had, and Gage had not, and she had landed somewhere in the middle of the two of them. Then she crossed the lot with the keys in her hand and opened the bay and let the morning into the shop, and the morning came in cool and smelled of creek water and cut hay from the one farm still working up the holler. There was a comfort in it that she could not have explained to anyone who had not lived it. The comfort of a thing done the same way at the same hour for 50 years, a comfort that asked nothing of you and gave you a floor to stand on. On Sunday evenings, she sat by the telephone and waited for it to ring, and sometimes it rang, and the signal held long enough for her to hear the grandchildren's voices going up at the ends of their sentences, the way young voices do, telling her about a soccer game or a tooth that had come loose, and sometimes the signal dropped, and she sat on with the dead receiver against her ear for a moment anyway, because the wanting did not drop when the call did. That was her life. It was small, and it was hers, and until that autumn, she had believed it was the last shape her life would ever take. Now here is the thing about Hattie that nobody in that county talked about anymore, because most of the people who would have known were dead or moved away, and because Hattie herself had spent 40 years making certain it stayed buried so deep that even she had to dig for it. Before the garage, before Gage even, Hattie Monroe had been a fighter. Not a woman who scrapped in parking lots and bar lots, though there were plenty enough of those in the mill towns she had come up in. A trained one? She had boxed and learned judo under a man named Samuel Ford at a low-brick gym on the south side of the city back in the years when a girl who walked into a fire-out gym got laughed out the door before anybody ever taught her how to make a fist. Hattie got laughed at exactly once. Samuel Ford, an old welterweight with a flattened nose and a voice like gravel sliding down a chute, had watched the laughing from the corner where he taped his hands, and he had watched the girl stand there in the middle of it and not flinch and not leave. And he had crossed the floor and said loud enough for the whole gym to hear it that the next man to laugh could go find another gym to be a fool in because this one was his. Then he had pointed Hattie at the heavy bag and shown her how to stand. And that was the beginning of everything she ever became. He took her on when the rest of them would not, and he drilled the technique into her bones for the better part of 10 years. The long, slow way, the way you teach a thing so it stays. Footwork until her shins ached and the chalk lines were worn off the floor. The redirect, the off-balance, the throw 1,000 times, and then 10,000 until her body knew the answer to a shove before her mind had asked the question. He used to put his big, rough hand flat on her sternum and say, "The calm lives here, not in the fists, and a person who keeps it here will beat a person twice her size, who keeps it in her temper every time all day long. Amen." She fought in regional tournaments through her 20s. She won a good deal more than she lost. In the small underground circle of people who knew she earned a name as the kind of fighter who never once threw the first punch and somehow always threw the last one. Samuel Ford used to tell anybody who would listen that Hattie had the calmest hands he had ever taught, that she could stand in front of a person with her heart going like a trip hammer and never let one beat of it reach her hands. He said it the way other men talked about their children. He said it right up until the day she walked out of the gym and never came back, and he never once asked her why, because by then he knew the whole town knew, and there are some things you do not make a person say out loud. There was one bout he liked to tell about in the years before, when there were still years before. A regional final, a girl from the city who outweighed Hattie by 20 pounds and had hands like a blacksmith and a reputation for ending things early. Everyone in the room had already counted Hattie out before the first round was halfway gone because the city girl came forward swinging, and Hattie gave ground and gave more ground. And a crowd that does not understand the sport mistakes giving ground for losing. But Samuel Ford understood it, and he sat calm in the corner with his arms folded because he could see what the crowd could not, which was that Hattie was not retreating. She was reading, letting the bigger girl throw and throw until the pattern of her showed itself, until the timing of her was as plain to Hattie as the timing of an engine that misses on the same cylinder every third stroke. And then, somewhere in the back half of it, the city girl threw the same hard right she had thrown 40 times, and this time it did not land on anything because the small old place where Hattie had been standing was empty and Hattie was already inside of it, turning, and the bigger girl's own force took her down and around and onto the canvas, and that was the end. And the room that had counted Hattie out came to its feet all at once and roared. The way a room will when it has just been shown something it did not believe was possible. Samuel Ford did not get up. He just unfolded his arms and nodded once to himself, the way a man nods when a thing he has built has done exactly what he built it to do. The calm lives here, he told her after in the locker room, his thumb on her sternum, not in the fists, and you keep it here, girl. You keep it here, and there is not a soul alive can take it off you. She had believed him. For a few more years, she had believed him entirely. And then the fire came and showed her there was at least one thing that could take it off her after all, which was the sight of herself sitting down quiet on a floor to die, and it had taken her 4 decades to learn that he had been right the whole time. And she had only mislaid it the way you mislay a tool in a dark corner and swear it is gone for good. Because something happened. Something burned the fight clean out of her, or buried it so deep under ash that she could not reach it anymore, and she walked away from all of it. She packed the 3 small trophies and the gloves and the photographs into a cardboard box. She shoved the box under a workbench. She never spoke of any of it again, not to Gage, not to her son, not to a single living soul. If you asked her about fighting, she would ask you if you had checked your tire pressure lately, with winter coming. If you pressed her, she would find something that needed doing at the far end of the shop and do it until you got tired of standing there. Whatever it was that broke in her was the kind of break that fighting could not set, the kind no doctor sets. So she said engines instead, because an engine at least will tell you the truth about what is wrong with it, if you listen long enough, and a person will lie to your face and to their own. She fixed bikes and cars and the occasional stubborn tractor quietly for 4 decades until the whole world forgot she had ever been anything at all but the old woman who fixed things off the dead road called Route 9. The young man who went down that wet night was named Dawson Armstrong, 23 years old, thin through the shoulders, soaked clean to the skin, shaking with the cold, and with that other thing, the thing that floods up through you after you have come close to dying and your body has not yet been told that you did not. His teeth were going a small, dry chatter he could not stop. Hattie brought him inside without a word. She sat him down on a metal stool near the space heater in the corner and put a clean shop towel into his hands and turned the heater so it faced him full on. His jacket was torn open at the shoulder seam where the road had grabbed it. Road rash ran down his left forearm in a raw pink stripe that had started to weep clear fluid through the dirt. His hands would not stop trembling, and he kept opening them and closing them slow. The way a man does when he is making sure all his fingers still answer the bell, that the nerve and the bone are all still talking to one another. Then Hattie walked right back out into the rain. She got both hands on the downed motorcycle by the frame, set her feet the way Samuel Ford had taught her to set them a lifetime ago, and dragged that machine across 40 feet of wet gravel to the bay, by herself in the dark. She was 71 years old. She weighed 140 pounds with her work boots on and her keys in her pocket. She dragged the bike up the slight grade of the lot and rolled it onto the lift like she had done it 10,000 times, because she had done it more than that. And the doing of it was in her arms the way the throw was below thought, below age. Dawson started up off the stool to help his good hand out, and she said one word without turning around. Sit, and he sat back down. She did not ask him a single question about how he had come to be flying down a dead road in the rain and the dark. She just turned on the work light over the lift and started looking the way she looked at every machine that came to her, like a doctor who's decided to take her time and get it right. The damage came up to her one piece at a time. Bent front forks, both of them, mice. Wheel cocked off, true. A radiator hose cracked along its length, leaking coolant in a slow green drip onto the concrete. The chain had jumped clean off the rear sprocket in the slide and chewed an ugly, bright groove into the engine case where the soft aluminum had no answer for hardened steel. The left brake lever was snapped off, flush a clean brake, the stub of it still clamped to the bar. It was bad. Not finished, but standing in the doorway of finished, looking in. The kind of job most shops up in the city would quote at $800 in 3 days if they took it on at all, which most of them would not on a bike that old. How far were you headed? She asked, not looking up from the forks, her glasses down on the end of her nose. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by the cold. Augusta, still about 300 miles. She nodded slowly. She did not say anything for a long while. Then this is going to take some doing. There is coffee on the shelf behind you. It is from this morning, but the heater will warm your hands around the cup, and that is most of what coffee is for anyhow. She worked through the next 5 hours straight, the way she had learned to work in the years when the work was all she had to keep her from the quiet of the house. She pulled a new radiator hose from her own stock and clamped it tight. She straightened the forks on a hydraulic press Gage had built out of scrap angle iron and a bottle jack before the boy on the stool was even born, leaning her whole small weight on the handle, reading the steel by the way it gave. She fished a used chain out of a parts bin in the back, a good chain off a wreck she had parted out years before, and she cleaned it link by link in a coffee can of solvent, her thumbs black with it, and fitted it to the sprockets one tooth at a time. And when she came to the broken brake lever and found she had nothing to match it on the shelf, she did not say so, and she did not stop. She took a length of steel bar stock from under the bench and she clamped it in the vise. And she made a new lever with a file and a hacksaw and a propane torch, and 40 years in her hands, bending it and filing it and holding it up against the good lever on the right side and bending it some more until in the lamplight you could not tell which one had come from the factory and which one had come out of an old woman's vise on a rainy night. She worked the way she had taught herself to work in the long years alone, which was to let the job set the pace and to refuse to be hurried by it or to hurry it herself. She cleaned every bolt before she ran it back in, wiping the threads on the rag, because a bolt that goes in dirty comes out fighting, and the man who put it in dirty is never the man who has to take it out. She torqued the head of the chain adjuster by feel, and then checked it with the wrench, and found her hand had been right to the click, and way it nearly always was after 50 years of asking it. She found a weeping fork seal the boy had not even known about, a small thing that would have left him stranded 100 miles on, and she pressed in a new one from a drawer of seals she kept sorted by size in an old fishing tackle box, and she said nothing about him, because there was no charge coming, and so there was no point in a speech. The space heater ticked in the corner. The rain came and went on the tin, hard, and then soft, and then hard again. And somewhere in the third hour, the boy on the stool warmed through now, and steadier began without being asked to talk a little, the way the warmth and the late hour and the small honest sounds of the work will sometimes open a person who has been holding himself shut. He said he had grown up without much. He said his father had died 2 years back, sudden, and that there were things he had meant to ask the man and never had, and that he had taken to riding long roads alone at night because the noise of the engine was the one thing loud enough to quiet the inside of his head. He did not say what he did for work, and Hattie did not ask, because in her shop a person's troubles were always welcome, and a person's business never was unless they offered it. She just listened, with her glasses down on her nose and her hands moving, and now and again she said a low word back that was a hard thing. Son or a man does not get over a father. He just learns to carry him, and the boy seemed to take some ease from the saying of it out loud to someone who was not trying to fix him, only to fix his bike. And Hattie, for her part, found that the talk warmed the shop in a way the heater could not, and that she had missed it. The simple sound of another voice in the bay after dark more than she had let herself know. Dawson watched the whole time. He did not have anywhere else to be, and he could not have left if he had. And after a while, the watching turned into a kind of trance, the bent gray head and the steady hands and the small, clean sounds, the file, the ratchet, the soft hiss of the torch, and under all of it, the rain on the tin and the drip into the can. He tried to help one time reaching for a socket on the bench, and Hattie set 2 fingers light on the back of his hand and moved it away without ever looking at him. "You will hand me the wrong one in the dark, and we will both be here until morning," she said, "and I have got eggs to fry at 6. He laughed, the first sound of anything but pain he had made all night, and then he went quiet again and watched. Somewhere around midnight, he cleared his throat. The shop was still except for her tools and the weather. "Ma'am, I have to tell you something, and I should have said it before you got this far." His voice was steadier, now warmed through, but there was Israeli writing under it. "I do not have the money for this. Not the whole of it. I have got maybe $40 in my wallet and a gas card that is close to maxed out, and that is the truth of it." She did not look up. She did not stop filing. "I did not ask you for any money. But the parts alone have got to run 200, and the time 5 hours of your time, more than that now. I cannot just," I said. She set the new lever down on the bench gentle and looked at him over the top of her glasses, and her voice came down soft the way you bring a voice down to settle a spooked animal. "I said I did not ask you for any money. Drink your coffee. It will not warm itself." He went quiet, and this time the quiet held. She finished the chain and tested the throttle twice, the engine catching ragged and then smoothing. She checked both brakes, front and back, pumping them with her thumb and her boot. She topped off the coolant from a jug, and then she let the engine run for a full 10 minutes while she stood beside it with her head tilted and her eyes half closed, listening the way some women listen for a baby breathing in the next room, listening for the one wrong note under all the right ones. There was none. Steady idle, no knock, no miss, no rattle that had not been there from the factory. She wiped her hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth and had been for years, and she tossed him the keys underhand, and he caught them against his chest with both hands like they were something alive. "She will get you to Augusta," Hattie said. "Take the curves easy when the road is wet, which it will be all the way down. Those forks are straight now, but they took a hard hit, and Steele remembers. Do not push her past 60 until you can get her looked at proper by daylight." Dawson stood up off the stool. He looked at the bike hole again, gleaming a little under the work light. He looked at the old woman. He had a thin face and tired eyes, and a jaw set in that particular way young men set their jaws when they are trying with everything they have not to look like a person who is out of road and out of options, and very far from anyone who knows their name. "I do not understand," he said. "Why would you do all this for me? You do not know me." Hattie looked at him then, really looked for the first time the way she had not let herself look at much of anything in a long time. And she saw what she always saw underneath in the young ones who came in out of options on a bad night. She saw herself, 40-some years gone, standing in a stranger's gym, soaked to the skin, with the rain still on her, with no money and no people and no place, hoping against her own experience that somebody on the other side of the room would look at her and see a person and not a problem. "Just help somebody else when they need it," she said. "That is the whole bill. That is the only thing I am charging you, and I will know if you don't pay it, because the world has got ways of telling me these things." He stared at her a second, and something moved across his face that she did not have a name for and did not try to give one. Then he stuck out his good hand, and she shook it, and his grip was strong and uncertain both at once, a young man's grip. He climbed onto the bike and pulled his helmet down over his wet hair and thumbed the starter, and the engine she had rebuilt caught clean on the first turn, and he rode out of the bay and out across the gravel and out into the storm. Hattie stood in the doorway of the garage she had built with her dead husband's hands, and she watched the single red taillight get smaller and smaller down Route 9, past the bend by the creek, until it was gone, swallowed whole by the dark and the rain and the pines. Then she shut off the lights. She dropped the padlock on the bay door and gave it the 2 extra rattles it needed to seat. She walked across the black lot to the small house behind the shop where she had slept alone for 11 years past the window, where Gage's chair still sat by the cold wood stove because she had never once found a reason good enough to move it. She did not think about Dawson Armstrong again that night, or the next day, or the day after that. She had no reason to think she ever would. She was wrong about that. She was wrong in a way she could not yet imagine and would not have believed if you had told her. and that wrongness was already on its way to her 300 miles down a wet road, carried by a young man on a bike with a hand-filed brake lever riding through the storm toward a city where he would type her name into a computer and stop breathing for a moment. But all that was still to come, for now there was just the rain and the house and the empty chair. 3 weeks passed. Business did not pick up. If anything, it got thinner. There was a brake job on a Tuesday for a man who paid her cash and did not say much. There was a fellow with a flat he could not break loose, and she broke it loose for him and patched it, and he paid her in a paper sack of tomatoes from his own garden, because that was what he had on him. And she took the tomatoes without comment because she had known his mother. And a man who offers you the only thing he has should never be made to feel the smallness of it. The rest of those 3 weeks was wind and creak and the slow drip into the coffee can and the eggs at 6 and the radio in the corner and the long blue evenings where the light went out of the holler an hour before it went out of the sky. Then on a Wednesday morning, the county taxman came up the lot. Clipboard under his arm, slacks pressed to a knife edge, no smile anywhere on him. He told her in a flat little voice that he had clearly used on a good many people who had less than he did, that her property taxes were 2/4 behind, $1,400. Hattie already knew that. She had been quietly robbing the grocery money to keep the power on through the cold months, eating eggs 4 nights out of 7, and telling herself she had always liked eggs, which was nearly true. But the taxman's flat little voice made her think for the first time in a hard and clear and unwelcome way about something she had been letting herself not think about. A man named Gary Holden had been buying up every commercial lot along the south stretch of Route 9 for the past year and a half. Holden was a developer out of the city, the kind with his own logo painted on the door of his truck, and a lawyer on a leash and a way of talking that made you feel slow even when you were not. He had a plan for the bottom of the holler. He wanted to tear down the old buildings, the ones the new highway had left to die, and put up a motorcycle resort. A rally complex, the glossy brochure called it. A place for wealthy weekend riders to drive their trailered machines down from the cities and get the biker experience of the open road and the brotherhood and the win with none of the grit that ever made any of it worth a single thing. Polished chrome and craft beer and a gift shop selling bandanas made in a factory overseas. To make the numbers work, Holden needed every property along that south stretch, every single lot. And Hattie Monroe's garage sat right in the dead middle of it like a bent nail in a board he could not pull and could not build over. Holden had come by twice already before that Wednesday. The first time 6 months back, he had been all warmth and sunshine. He drove up the lot in a silver sport utility that had never in its life touched a dirt road before that morning, and he came into the bay smiling, and he took Hattie's grease-black hand in both of his clean soft ones and pumped it and called her ma'am about 9 times in a minute. He offered her $90,000 for the building and the land it sat on. He said it like it was a gift he had brought her, like a man laying down a covered dish. Hattie poured him a cup of coffee. He did not drink, and she let him finish his whole speech about the future of the valley and the boss it would bring, and the rising tide that lifts all boats, and when he was done, she said no thank you, and watched him try to figure out where the rest of the sentence had gone. The second time 3 months back, he had brought a lawyer, and the warmth was gone. The two of them stood in her bay in their clean shoes, hands folded, and they explained to her in the patient and gentle voices that men use on a woman they have already decided is simple, that the building was not up to current code, not even close, and that the county had the power to condemn a structure like this one if it found cause. That 90,000 was a generous figure, more than generous, for a building in this condition, and that generous figures had a way of not staying on the table forever, the way the world moved. Hattie listened to every word of it all the way to the end, the way Samuel Ford had taught her to let an opponent throw his whole combination so she could see the shape of him. Then she told them both in a voice she had not used in 40 years to get off her property. And she said it in such a way that the lawyer's dignity moved him toward the door considerably faster than he would have liked. She had thought that was the end of it. She had a habit she would come to understand of believing that hard things ended just because she had stood up to them once. Now here is where it turned. Here is where the rain stopped being weather and started being a story. On a Thursday morning, 3 weeks and some days after the boy on the bike, Hattie drove up to the shop in the half-dark before opening and found the bay door caved in. Somebody had taken a sledge or a bat to it in the night. The lock was smashed clean off and lay in the gravel. One hinge was bent out, so the door hung crooked and low, like a jaw that has been broken and set wrong. She stood there a moment in the gray light with the truck still running behind her, and then she shut it off and went in. Inside, three of her toolboxes had been dragged off the benches and dumped, in wrenches and sockets and screwdriver tips lay scattered all across the concrete, kicked into corners, ground underfoot. A 5-quart can of motor oil had been poured out over her main workbench. The bench Gage built with his own hands the first winter they were married. And the oil had soaked down into the old wood and run off the edges and dripped down the legs into a black slick pool on the floor that caught and held the light from the open door. The press was untouched. The lift was untouched. The cash box, what little was in it, had not been opened. Nothing had been stolen. This was not a robbery. This was a sentence with the period left off on purpose, so she would lie awake nights waiting for the rest of it. Somebody wanted Hattie Monroe to understand in a way she could not talk herself out of, that her place was not safe anymore. That staying carried a quant in that the people who had decided to make her pay it could raise the price any time the mood took them, and that there was nobody in that county who would lift a finger to stop them. Hattie stood in the middle of her wrecked shop for a long time and did not move. She could smell the oil sharp and heavy. The smell of her whole life turned into a weapon against her. She could hear it dripping off the bench legs slow, with almost the same rhythm as the leak in the roof, so that for a moment that the shop seemed to be ticking, like a thing about to go off. And under her breastbone something stirred that had not stirred in 40 years, a low hot pressure rising, a thing she recognized in her body, the way you recognize the first turn of an old sickness, and she did not welcome it, and she breathed through it. She breathed the way Samuel Ford had taught her to breathe in the corner before a bout, slow in through the nose, slower out through the mouth. The calm lives here, not in the fists, until the pressure crested and broke and ran back down to wherever it lived. And her hands, when she held them out in front of her in the gray light, were steady. Then she bent down and picked up the first wrench off the floor. She wiped it clean on a fresh rag, and she put it back in its place on the pegboard. She did that for every tool, every wrench, every socket, every screwdriver and bit and hex key and feeler gauge, picking each one up off the cold concrete, wiping it down, finding its place smallest to largest, the way Gage had taught her. It took her the better part of 3 hours, and she did it slow, and she did not let herself hurry, because hurrying was a way of letting them set the pace, and she would set her own pace in her own shop until the day they carried her out of it. There was a thing she understood standing there with the rag black in her hand that the men who had done this in the night did not understand and never would. They thought the mess was the message. They thought the fear was the point that a frightened old woman would do their arithmetic for them and arrive at the only answer they had left her. But Hattie had been frightened before truly frightened in a way no man with a sledgehammer could ever manage. And she had learned the long way around that fear is only weather. It comes down on you and it is terrible while it lasts, and then it passes over. And the thing to do is not to make any large decisions while it is raining inside you, because the decisions you make in the fear are the decisions the men who frightened you wanted you to make all along. So she did not decide anything that morning. She only cleaned. She put each tool back in its place and let the cleaning be the whole of her thinking. And by the time the wall was full again and the bench was just wood again, the weather had moved off the way it always does. If you give it long enough and do not fight it, and what was left behind washed clean was the same thing that had been there under the fear the whole while, which was that this was her shop and her husband's shop, and she was not going anywhere until she was good and ready. And she was not anywhere near ready. When she was done, the wall of tools looked exactly the way it had looked the morning before, and the morning before that, and for the 11 years since Gage died and the 40 years before that. She mopped up the oil. She scrubbed the bench down with degreaser and a stiff wire brush, working the blackened out of the grain of the wood until it was just wood again. Stained dark but clean, the wood Gage had planned and joined that first winter. She wrestled the bent hinge as straight as it would ever go again and hung the door back square enough to lock with a new padlock from the box of spares. She did not call the sheriff. She knew who had sent the message, and she knew that the sheriff and his deputies had been playing golf out at the new club with Gary Holden's people since the start of the summer, and she knew with the flat, clear knowledge of a woman who had lived her whole life among the people who do the work and not the people who own it, exactly how far a telephone call would get her. It would get her a deputy taking notes he would never type up. and a report that would go in a drawer, and word getting back to the man who paid for the message that the old woman had run crying to the law, and another visit worse than the first. She locked up that night, and she did not sleep much, and she watched the dark out the kitchen window for headlights that did not come. 2 days later, they came in daylight, which was its own kind of message. Two men in a black pickup truck with mud on it that had been put there on purpose to make it look like a working truck. Big men, both of them construction builds, thick through the arms and the neck, the kind of size that comes half from labor and half from a bottle of pills. One had a shaved head and a faded blue tattoo crawling up the side of his throat, something that had been a word once and was a smear now. The other wore a polo shirt that pulled tight across his shoulders and a watch on his wrist that was worth more than Hattie cleared in a good season. They walked into her bay like the deed to it was already folded in a back pocket. Ms. Monroe, the one in the polo, did the talking friendly as a snake sunning itself on a warm rock. Mr. Holden wanted us to come by and ask if you had had a chance to think any more about his offer. He surely would hate for there to be a misunderstanding. I have thought about it, Hattie said. The answer is the same one I gave him in person twice. She was holding a torque wrench, not as a weapon. She had been in the middle of a job setting the head bolts on a little sedan that belonged to a woman who taught the children's class at the church down in the valley, and the wrench was simply in her hand, the way a tool had been in her hand most of the waking hours of her life. The bald one stepped in closer, close enough that she could smell the cigarettes on him and the cheap heavy cologne laid over them. You really ought to give it another think, lady. This building is a wreck. Roof is caving, floor is going. Somebody could get hurt bad in a place like this. He let it sit there a second in the air between them. Be a real shame. Old woman all alone way out here. Hattie did not step back. If you had known what to look for, you would have seen it happen the way you can see a still pond change a half second before the fish breaks the surface. Her feet had drifted apart to the width of her shoulders without her telling them to. Her weight had settled down out of her heels and onto the balls of her feet. Her breathing had gone long and slow and quiet. 40 years of rust on the hinges, and the body remembered the whole of the song the instant the first note played. But these two did not know what to look for. To them, she was nothing but a small old woman in a man's work shirt holding a wrench in a falling down garage at the bottom of a road that nobody drove. I have been here close on 50 years, Hattie said, and her voice was perfectly level. My husband and I built this building with our hands. I expect I will be here a good while yet, if it is all the same to your Mr. Holden, and even if it is not. The bald one's face did something ugly. He reached out and knocked the torque wrench out of her hand, a flat, hard slap, and it hit the concrete with a clang that rang off the cinder block walls and rolled. Then he put his open palm flat against the center of her chest and shoved her hard, the way a man shoves a woman he has decided is not really a person to move her about to make a point to feel the giving of her. What happened next took about 2 seconds, and the man in the polo shirt would tell it 3 different ways over the following week, and get it wrong every single time, because his eyes had not been fast enough to catch it, and his mind would not let him believe the version his eyes did catch. Hattie caught the bald man's wrist as it came forward into the shove. She did not grab it and brace against it the way a person braces the way he expected. She rolled her own hand up and under and around and turned his wrist down and out, and in the very same motion, she pivoted her right hip in toward him and turned her whole small body like a gate swinging open, so that all the force the man had put into shoving her kept right on traveling past her, past the place where his feet could follow it out into empty space. His own weight took him. It carried him sideways and down fast, and he stumbled hard into the parts rack and bounced off it in a clatter of falling cans and dropped onto one knee on the bare concrete with all his weight behind it. The crack of the kneecap on the floor was loud in the shop. It made the man in the polo flinch as if it had been his own. The bald one knelt there a second, blinking his mouth open, genuinely unsure how the floor had come up to meet him, how the old woman was still standing exactly where she had been standing, calm, her hands open at her sides. The polo shirt started forward, his face going from confusion to something meaner, and Hattie turned to face him square. She did not raise her fists. She did not drop into a crouch. She did not say a word. She just stood there, balanced her weight down, her hands open and loose and easy at her sides, her chin level, her eyes steady on his, breathing slow. It was the stance Samuel Ford had built into her over 10 years, the stance of a person who is not afraid because being afraid would be a waste of the attention she needs for what is in front of her. The polo shirt stopped. He looked at his partner on the floor holding his knee, hissing through his teeth. He looked at the old woman who had not raised her voice and had not raised her hands and had somehow put a man twice her size down on the concrete. And the animal part of him, the part that reads a thing faster than the proud part, once it read told him to be very still, and for once in his life, he listened to it. "You tell Mr. Holden I am not selling," Hattie said quiet, "and you tell him to keep his boys home. The next one that puts his hands on me is liable to trip over something a good deal worse than his own feet." They left. The bald one limped to the truck dragging the bad leg and had real trouble pulling himself up into the cab, and the polo shirt did not help him do it, which told you something about both of them. Hattie watched them out the bay door, and she listened to the gravel crunch under the tires until the engine noise was gone down the road and around the bend by the creek, and then there was only the creek itself and the slow drip into the can. She walked over and picked the torque wrench up off the floor bar and set it back on the bench. Then she sat down on her stool and she picked up her water bottle and she took a long drink and she found that her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from that other thing. From the old familiar surge, the hot flood rising up out of the locked place under her breastbone, where she had kept it shut away for 4 decades, the thing that had made her good and the thing that had nearly ruined her both at once because they were the same thing, they had always been the same thing. She set the bottle down on the bench and held her 2 hands out in front of her in the fluorescent light and looked at them shake. The skin was thin now, spotted brown with the years, the knuckles grown big and knobbed. But the joints still moved the way Samuel Ford had drilled them to move a lifetime ago, light and quick and clean, no wasted motion anywhere in them. Some things the body simply will not give up no matter how many years the mind spends ordering it to forget. She sat there a long while as the shaking eased. The shop was quiet, no customers, no traffic on the dead road, just the hum of the long fluorescent tube overhead and the drip falling slow into the coffee can she had set under the worst of the roof leaks, back when Gage was still alive to stand there and laugh at her for it, telling her he would fix that leak, come spring every spring for the 30 years they had together, and never once fixing it because some leaks you keep on purpose. For the sound of them, though neither of them ever said so. For a few minutes she let herself believe it was finished, that they had carried the answer back to the man who paid them, and that he would chalk her up as more trouble than the lot was worth and let her be, and that she could sink back down into her small and shrinking life and be left in peace with the wind and the creek and the photographs of grandchildren she only ever saw on a glowing screen. She picked up a parts catalog off the counter and turned the pages without seeing one of them. Her shoulders came down from around her ears where they had been living for days. Her breathing slowed all the way. She thought about supper, about whether there were enough eggs left, about whether she ought to drive down to the valley for more. Then the mail came the next morning, and everything Hattie thought she understood about the kind of fight she was in turned right over like a loaded truck on black ice, slow and total, and impossible to stop once it had begun. It was a certified letter. She had to sign for it standing in the bay door, with the rain dripping off the eave, the carrier holding the little gray box out to her, with a look on his face like he wished he had any other route in the whole county that morning. She tore it open at the counter, county letterhead, the seal printed in blue. The office of the building inspector. 2 full pages of dense cold legal language that she had to read 3 times over to be certain she was not bending the words into something gentler than they meant the way a frightened person will. Her garage had been scheduled for a full code compliance review. If critical violations were found and the letter made it plain that the office expected them to be, the structure would be condemned effective immediately upon the finding, and she would have 30 days to vacate the premises and remove her belongings. The inspection was set for 2 weeks out to the day. And there at the very bottom, in a paragraph of fine print so small, she had to go fetch the magnifying glass she kept for reading, stripped serial numbers off old engine blocks, was the line that took all the air straight out of her chest and did not give it back. The review had been formally requested by Holden Development Limited Liability Company. Hattie set the letter down on the counter very carefully, the way you set down a thing that you have suddenly understood might go off in your hand. She understood exactly what she was holding. This was not about building codes. This was not about anybody's safety, least of all hers. This was a man with money deciding that he wanted a thing, and being willing to reach his clean, soft hands right down into the machinery of the county and turn the gears slow and patient until they ground down the one old woman standing between him and what he wanted. She had seen the shape of this before. Not in any war, she had never been near one. She had seen it in the long, slow dying of the mill town, where she had been a girl, and the way the men who owned the mill always somehow found the law standing on their side of the line, and the men and women who only worked the mill always somehow found that same law pressing its full weight down on the backs of their necks. The tools were only paper here, a county form instead of a chained gate, a fine print paragraph instead of a man with a club. But the hand that held the paper was the very same hand that had always held it in every town she had ever lived in, and it had never once been her hand, and it never would be. She called a lawyer that afternoon, a woman in the county seat who had handled the simple business of Gage's estate years before kindly and for a fair price. The lawyer listened to all of it, every word without interrupting, and Hattie could hear in the quality of her silence that none of it surprised her. And then she told Hattie the truth, which was a hard thing for a kind person to do. She said that fighting a code review, like this one, with the developer's money behind it and the county's own people leaning, the way they were so plainly leaning would cost $5,000 just to file the formal challenge and get a hearing on the calendar. And that even then, there was no guarantee, at the end of it, no guarantee at all, and that she would not feel right taking the money knowing the odds. Hattie did not have $5,000. She had a little over $1,000 in the checking account and a pension that covered eggs and electricity and gasoline if she watched every dime in a building full of tools that were worth a great deal more to her as memory than they would ever fetch from a man with a truck at an auction. She thanked the lawyer and meant it, and hung up the telephone and stood in the empty shop in the early dark with her hand still resting on the receiver for a long while. That night, Hattie did a thing she had not done in years. She walked to the very back of the shop to the corner where the shadows pooled the deepest behind the hydraulic press, and she knelt down beside the old workbench with her knees complaining, and she reached underneath and pulled out the dusty cardboard box that had not seen the light since the spring Gage died, when she had taken it out for reasons she could no longer recall, and put it right back. She carried it to the counter and set it under the lamp and stood looking at the closed flaps for a moment before she opened them. Inside were the 3 trophies. Brass figures of a fighter with the fists held up mounted on little wooden bases that the years had tarnished almost black, so that the brass had to be turned just so under the lamp to catch any light at all. A pair of boxing gloves so old the red leather had cracked along every single crease and gone stiff, the laces hard as wire, and a photograph curled at the edges of herself and Samuel Ford, standing outside the low brick gym on the south side. Both of them young him with his flattened nose and his arms slung around her shoulders and a fat cigar clamped in his teeth. Her grinning straight into the camera like she had just whipped the entire world and was glancing around for whoever was foolish enough to be next. And underneath all of it, half buried at the very bottom of the box, the corner of a second photograph, the paper gone soft and gray with old handling. She did not take that one out that night. She saw the corner of it, and her hand went still over the box. And she put the trophies and the gloves and the gym photograph back in on top of it, and she closed the flaps, and she pushed the box down to the end of the counter because she was not ready, and she knew with certainty that she was not ready, and she had learned a long, long time ago to leave the things she was not ready for exactly where they lay until the day she was. She turned off the lamp. She locked the bay door, which took the 3 tries it always took now since the hinge would never sit true again, and she walked across the dark lot to the house past Gage's empty chair in the window, and she lay down on top of the covers in her clothes and listened to the rain start up again on the roof. And she thought lying there that she was 71 years old and that she had given the whole of her one life to a road the world had decided did not matter. In a building she had raised with a man who was 11 years in the ground, in the church cemetery a mile down that road, and that now a stranger she had met twice was going to take it all away from her with a piece of paper and the patience of money, and that there was not one single thing in this world she could do to stop him. That is what she believed lying there in the dark with the rain coming down. And she was wrong about that too, as wrong as a person can be, but she had no way at all of knowing it yet. She had no way of knowing that 3 weeks back on a wet night with a used chain and a hand-filed brake lever, and 4 words she had said and forgotten by sunup, she had already set the whole of her own rescue rolling toward her down the years. The world keeps a ledger you never get to see, written in a hand you will never learn to read. Hattie Monroe was about to find out that it had been keeping hers all along, and that it balanced, and that the balancing was nearer than she could dream. The certified letter sat on the counter for 3 more days before she could make herself read it a fourth time. She kept the shop open the whole while because to not open it would have been a kind of surrender she was not ready to put her name to. She swept the floor at 6. She lined the wrenches up by size. One car came in across the whole stretch, the little sedan belonging to the Sunday school teacher down in the valley in for the brakes. Hattie had been setting when the two men came, and Hattie finished the job and charged her for the pads alone and waved off the rest. And the woman took both of Hattie's hands in hers at the bay door and said she would pray for her by name every night. And Hattie thanked her and meant it and knew that prayer, however kind, was not going to file a $5,000 challenge with the county. In between the sweeping and the waiting, she began to pack. Not everything, just the things that were truly hers and not the buildings. The framed photographs of the grandchildren off the counter, the school portraits with their bright fake backgrounds. A coffee mug her son had made for her at one of those paint-it-yourself places the year before he moved out west, lopsided and glazed a truly ugly green, the single most beautiful object she owned in all the world. The worn Bible with Gage's mother's handwriting, climbing up the margins in faded ink. And beneath those, in Hattie's own square hand, the notes she had made over the long years. Little underlinings of the verses that had carried her through the bad seasons, the spring. Gage died, the autumn, the mill closed, the longer winters. She stacked the boxes by the door. She was not ready to leave. But she was getting ready to be ready, which is how it works when you already know in the deepest part of your gut that you are going to lose. You start letting go in pieces, one small thing at a time, so that when the day finally comes, there will be that much less of you left for them to tear loose all at once. On the fourth day, Gary Holden came in person. She heard the vehicle before she saw it, the soft, expensive hum of the silver sport utility coming up the lot, so different from the rough, working trucks that had once filled that gravel, that the sound of it alone set her teeth. He got out alone this time. No lawyer trailing him, no boys in a muddied pickup, just the man himself in pressed slacks in a quarter-zip pullover the color of money, his clean shoes finding the one dry path across the wet lot as if they had some private radar for staying clean. Mrs. Monroe. He stopped at the very edge of the bay where the concrete floor met the gravel of the lot, and he did not step inside, and Hattie understood at once that the not stepping inside was a thing he had decided on beforehand. A small, cold way of telling her that the building was already in his mind, not quite hers anymore, that he would not soil his shoes in a thing that was halfway to being his. Mr. Holden, I heard there was an unpleasantness out here last week. Some men. I want you to know before anything else that it had nothing to do with me, and I do not condone it. He said it smoothly, every word in its place, the way a man says a thing he has stood in front of a mirror and practiced. I am a businessman. I deal in paper, not in muscle. Whatever happened, it was not at my direction. You are a liar, Hattie said, and she said it mildly the way another woman might note that it looked like it could turn off and rain again before evening. But I expect you have made your peace with that. A man does not get a quarter zip that nice telling the truth. Something flickered across his face quick. And then it was gone, and he smiled. And the smile was the very worst thing about him because there was no anger anywhere in it. There was nothing in it at all but patience. I am going to be honest with you, he said, because I think you are a sharp woman, sharper than most, and I think you will appreciate it more than you appreciate being handled. You are going to lose the building. The inspection in 10 days is a formality. I know what is wrong with it down to the line item because I have had a licensed man go over your original plans and the aerials, and there is enough wrong here to condemn it 3 times over the wiring alone, the roof, the footings. After it is condemned, the county sells the lot at auction to recover the back taxes you owe, and I buy it at that auction for a fraction of the $90,000 I offered you in good faith twice. So those are the 2 roads in front of you, Mrs. Monroe, and I want you to see them clear. You can take the $90,000 now today this morning and walk away with real money in your pocket and your dignity entirely intact. Or you can fight and lose and walk away with nothing at all, not even the dignity. There is no third road. I have built my whole life on the fact that there is almost never a third road, no matter how badly people want one to be there. Hattie wiped her hands slow on the rag finger by finger and looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he shifted his weight. My husband and I poured the footings for this building in the spring of 1974, she said. We hauled the block up from the river bottom in a truck. We borrowed it from his brother, who is also dead now. Gage laid the bottom course of block, every one of them on his knees, and I laid the top course standing on a plank, because his back was already going bad even then, and he could not bend to the height. And we argued the whole time about whether my courses were plumb, and they were. We ran clean out of money before we could afford the roof, and we worked under a canvas tarp that leaked worse than the tin ever has for 2 whole years until we had saved enough for the metal. We raised our boy in the little house behind the shop, and my husband died right there on that stool by that lift with a customer's transmission half out of the car 11 years ago this coming April. So you will have to forgive me, Mr. Holden. If I do not see a building when I look around in here, I do not see footings and wiring and a roof. I see a marriage. And I do not recall ever once in 50 years putting a marriage up for auction. I would not know how to write the ticket. The smile finally left him then. It went all at once the way a light goes out, and for a second the patience went with it, and she saw what was underneath, which was a man who had been told no by a woman he could not move and did not know how to file it. He stood there, and whatever he had planned to say next did not fit anymore, and he turned without another word and walked back to the silver vehicle across his one dry path and got in and drove off down the dead road. Hattie watched the dust of him settle in the gravel, and she felt underneath all the fear that had been living in her chest for 2 weeks, the first small hard ember of something else. Something she had not let herself feel since the day she walked out of Samuel Ford's gym for the last time. Not hope, it was too hard and too small for hope. Something more like refusal. That ember kept her up that night. And somewhere past midnight, with the rain ticking on the tin and the can filling drop by drop, she got up off the bed where she had not been sleeping, and she crossed the lot to the dark shop, and she turned on the lamp over the counter, and she opened the box again. This time she took everything out. She set the 3 brass fighters on the counter in a row. She lifted out the cracked old gloves and laid them down. She took out the photograph of herself and Samuel Ford, young and grinning outside the gym, and she ran her thumb over the boys' faces they had both worn then, and she set it gently aside. And then there was nothing left in the box but the one photograph at the very bottom, the corner gone soft and gray. And she made herself reach in and lift it out into the lamplight and hold it up and look at it full. 2 people standing in front of the blackened, burned-out shell of a large building. A man and a young woman. The man had his arm around the young woman's shoulders, holding her up, really, because it was plain, even in the old gray photograph, that she could barely stand on her own. There were white bandages wrapped around both of the woman's hands and a square gauze pad taped to the side of her face. The man's shirt was scorched black down one entire side, and the skin of his forearm was wound round and round with gauze where the fire had reached him through the burning cloth. They were both squinting hard against a fierce noon sun, and the man was grinning. Grinning the impossible, light-headed grin of a person who had walked straight into a fire that very morning and somehow walked back out of it and could not yet believe his own luck, with a soot-streaked, half-dead young woman alive and breathing under his arm. His name was Dante Armstrong, and for the first time in 40 years, standing alone at her counter in the small hours, Hattie Monroe let herself remember the whole of it start to finish, instead of slamming the door on it the way she had slammed it 10,000 times. The Glenwood textile mill, where she had kept the books in a little glassed-in office, and Dante had run a dye line 2 full floors below her, a tall, easygoing man she had known to nod to and little more. She had been 26 years old. It was October, a bright, cold October, the leaves down off the trees. A boiler line failed in the basement late in the morning, and the fire came up through that old wooden-floored building so fast that the alarm bells and the first real smoke seemed to arrive in the same breath. And the south stairwell, the one nearest her office, was already roaring like the inside of a chimney by the time anybody on the upper floors understood that the day had stopped being an ordinary day. Hattie had gone the wrong way in the smoke. That was the thing she had spent 40 years unable to forgive herself for, though there was nothing to forgive, because the smoke takes your sense of north and south and turns it inside a person. And the people who go the right way and the people who go the wrong way are most often only telling you where they happen to be standing, not how brave they were. She had gone the wrong way away from the loading doors and deeper into the building. And she had ended up at the dead end of a hallway in the records room, and the drop ceiling panels above her had begun to glow a low orange, and the air down at the floor where she had crouched to breathe had begun to taste of the fire itself. And she had given herself up. That was the other thing, the thing she had buried deepest of all, the thing she had never told Gage or anyone. She had sat down on the floor with her back against a cold steel filing cabinet because her legs had simply quit and would not answer her, and she had thought very calmly with a calm that frightened her later. More than the fire ever had, that this was the place where it ended, and she had been almost grateful that the deciding of it was finally out of her hands. The fighter who never threw the first punch, who Samuel Ford swore had the calmest hands he ever taught, had sat down in a burning building and gotten ready to die without a sound because she did not know how to call out for help, because nobody had ever once in her hard young life come when she called. And then a hand had closed around her wrist. Dante Armstrong, who barely knew her name, who had no earthly business being on that floor at all, had come up the burning south stair, counting heads against a list he kept in his head, and he had found her at the dead end of the hall and gotten her up under his arm, and he had walked her 200 feet back down a hallway. She could not see 1 foot into both of them, bent double under the smoke, and where the corridor was worst, where the heat came off one wall like the open door of a furnace, he had put his own body between her and the wall and his own arm up against it to hold a sagging door open, and he had carried her the last of the way when her legs gave out under her, a second time out through a loading door into the parking lot in the hard, clean, ordinary October sun. 11 people died in the Glenwood fire that morning. Hattie Monroe was not one of the 11, and the only reason in all the wide world was a man named Dante Armstrong, who had burned his own forearm down past the skin, holding a door open 1 second longer than was sane to get a near stranger through it. She had tried to thank him afterward. She had gone to the hospital ward where they were treating the burned with a card in her bandaged hand that she could not find a single word to put inside of, because there are no words, there have never been any words for it, and he had waved the card off the same gentle way she would one day wave off a torn jacket and $40 on a rainy night, and he had said the only thing about it she ever truly remembered him saying. He had said, "You would have done it for me." And she had wanted with everything that was in her, with her whole scorched and rattled young heart, to be the kind of person he so plainly and so generously assumed she already was. And she had spent some part of every single year since then quietly wondering whether she had ever even once managed to be that person, or whether she had only managed to mean to. The mill never reopened. The town came apart the slow way that mill towns come apart when the mill goes family by family, year by year. Dante moved on for work the way working men have to, and the last she had heard of him directly was a Christmas card or two, and then the cards stopped the way they do, and the only thing she ever learned after that came secondhand, and years late from a woman who had known a woman who had known him, that Dante Armstrong had married a fine woman from down south, and had a boy, and had moved away, and had passed on somewhere down in Georgia. Hattie had said a prayer for him at her own kitchen table when she heard it alone, and had felt the old debt settle a little heavier in her chest, the stone she had long ago learned to breathe around, because she could not put it down and could not pay it off. She had never repaid it. That was the truth she sat with at her counter that night, the soft gray photograph held flat in her too thin hands. The single bravest thing that any living person had ever done for her, the saving of her whole life, and she had answered it with a card she could not write in, and a lifetime of meaning to do better. And now she was an old woman about to lose the last thing in the world she had, and there was no Dante Armstrong left anywhere under the sky to come up the burning stair for her this time and that. I don't know, more than the building, more than Holden, more than the money or the law or the fear was the thing that finally broke her composure there alone in the small hours. She pressed the photograph flat against her chest with both palms over her heart, and she wept the way she had not let herself weep since the morning she set the coffee down on the bench and knew. The way her shoulders had wept then, hard and silent and shaking, with the fluorescent tube humming over her and the drip falling slow and steady into the can, marking the time the way it always had. She did not sleep at all that night, but somewhere in the gray hour before the dawn came down into the holler, she made a decision, and it was a strange one, and it had nothing whatever to do with Gary Holden or the building or the law, because she had finally and fully accepted down in her bones that she was going to lose all of it and there was nothing to be done. She decided that if she was going to lose the building, she was not going to lose herself a second time inside of it. She had lost herself once in the fire, sitting down to die without a sound, and she had spent 40 years afterward losing herself by inches, burying the woman in photographs under grease and routine and silence, so ashamed of having needed saving, so ashamed of having sat down that she had punished the woman ever after by refusing to let her exist. She decided in that gray hour that she would not do it anymore. She picked up the photograph of Dante Armstrong and the photograph of Samuel Ford, and she did not put them back in the box and slide it under the bench. She propped them up against the cash register where she would see them every single morning when she opened the bay and every evening when she counted out the empty till. She had spent 40 years acting as though the young woman in those photographs had died in that fire alongside the 11 who really had. She decided she would spend whatever days were left to her in that shop in the open company of the people who had made her the man who taught her to stand and the man who taught her to live. She had 10 days until the inspection. She spent them the only way she knew how to spend a day. Open the bay at 6, sweep the floor, line the wrenches up by size, wait. But word it turned out had begun to move. It moves in country places the way water moves underground, slow and unseen root to root to root, until it surfaces somewhere you would never have guessed. The Sunday school teacher whose brakes she had fixed for the price of the poundage told her own sister, who tended the bar at the one place still open in the valley, who told it to a man who rode his motorcycle through on the weekends to feel the curves, who told it to 3 more at a gas stop 40 miles east, leaning on their machines in the sun. A retired structural engineer who had grown up on Route 9 as a boy, who now lived 2 counties over, heard a version of it at his church and drove all the way out one slow afternoon. Not to get a thing fixed, just to stand in the bay and look around at the old building. He half remembered and shake his head and ask Hattie quietly, hat in his hand. Whether there was anything at all a man with a license and some free time and a debt to the road he grew up on might be able to do. Hattie did not put much stock in any of it. She had lived too long and lost too much to set her hopes down on the back of talk. She thanked the engineer for the visit kindly and told him she did not reckon there was much anybody could do at this point, that the thing was already decided in offices she would never see. He nodded and he looked at the bent bay door for a good while, and he ran his hand along one of the cinder block courses she had laid plumb in 1974. And then he drove off, and she figured, as she always figured, that that was the end of it. But the talk did not stop just because Hattie had stopped expecting anything from it. It went on without her the way water goes on running under the ground, whether or not anyone is thirsty up above. The bartender in the valley told it to a rider who came in dusty off a long day, and the rider carried it 2 states the next weekend and told it at a fuel stop to a man he had ridden with for 30 years, and that man told it to his wife, who had grown up poor in a mill town herself and knew exactly what it was to watch a man with money decide he wanted the ground you stood on. An old woman who would not sell on a dead road with a developer's lawyers circling. A garage she had built with her own hands. The detail that traveled furthest, the one that made people set down their coffee, was the one about her dragging the wrecked bike inside in the rain and rebuilding it through the night and refusing the boys $40. Because that detail told them the kind of person she was before they ever heard a word about the kind of person Holden was, and a story always carries furthest when the listener has already decided whose side they are on by the end of the first sentence. None of it reached Hattie. She had no way of knowing that her name was being spoken with respect at campfires and counters she would never see, that the small thing she had done on a wet night was working its ways outward through the country in widening rings like a stone dropped in still water. She only knew that the shop was quiet and that the days were running down toward the inspection one at a time, and that the engineer had come and gone, and nothing had come of it that she could see. She figured, as she always figured, that talk was just talk, and that the world she lived in was not the kind where talk turned into 67 engines on a gold morning. She was about to be proven wrong, beautifully and completely wrong, but a person does not get a warning before a thing like that. A person just gets the morning. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that on the 8th day before the inspection, 200 miles away in the city, a young investigative reporter named Dawson Armstrong was sitting in front of a computer at a battered desk at a small regional newspaper building, the last pieces of a case against a developer named Gary Holden that he had been building quietly and stubbornly and mostly on his own time for 8 months. And he had just typed one more address into a county property database to check one more of Holden's targets along a back road called Route 9, and the name that came up attached to the deed had stopped him cold with his hand still on the keys. Monroe's Garage, Hattie Monroe. He knew that name. He knew that road knew it in the bones of his shoulder and the scar healing on his forearm. He had gone down hard on that road in the rain 3 weeks back, and an old woman had walked out of a lit garage into the storm and dragged his bike inside with her own hands and rebuilt it through the whole of the night and refused twice to take a single dollar from him and told him instead to go and help somebody else someday, that it was the only bill she was charging. He had ridden away in the dark thinking she was the kindest stranger he would ever meet in his life, and that he would never see her again, and that some kindnesses you just have to carry. And now her name was sitting square in the middle of Gary Holden's spreadsheet with a code review pending and a condemnation flagged, and the very same fingerprints Dawson had spent 8 months learning to recognize smeared all over the paperwork. A false complaint filed by the developer himself, a county inspector's office that did not ask who had filed it, a pattern run on small landowners across 4 whole counties, the identical trick every single time, dress it up however you liked. Buy the lot cheap for the back taxes after the county condemned it on a complaint the buyer had quietly arranged. Dawson sat back slow from the screen, and then he reached into the bottom drawer of the desk where he kept the few things that mattered, and he took out a photograph his father had carried folded in his wallet for 40 years and had taken out and pressed into Dawson's hand the last Christmas they ever had together before the heart attack took him in the spring 2 years back. Fast, the way his father would have wanted if anybody had asked. A man and a young woman in front of a burned-out mill. The man, his father, young and tall and grinning, his forearm wrapped in gauze, holding up a soot-streaked young woman who could barely stand on her own 2 feet. His whole life, Dante Armstrong had told that story. Every year on the anniversary of the fire in October, he had sat Dawson down at the kitchen table and told the whole of it, the boiler and the bells and the wrong turn she had taken into the records room and the orange glow in the ceiling and the hand he had closed around her wrist. She was the bravest person I ever knew, his father said every year, and the stubbornest, because she had sat herself down on the floor to die rather than call out and ask a living soul for help. And I have never once in all my life been able to walk past a stubborn person sitting down quiet in a fire. And he had made Dawson promise him something that last Christmas in the particular way that dying men have of extracting a promise holding his son's hand too hard. He had made him promise that if Dawson ever anywhere came across a person too proud or too stubborn or too beaten down to ask for the help they needed, he was to help them anyway, no matter what it cost him, because that was the only debt in the world worth carrying, the kind you can never pay back to the one who gave it, so you pay it forward to a stranger instead, and trust that it comes out even somewhere you will never see. Dawson had always thought it was just a story about his father's hard young years. He had never once known the woman's name. His father had told that story 100 times across Dawson's whole childhood, and never, not one single time, said her name out loud, the way you do not say the name of a thing you hold too sacred to risk in ordinary air. But there it was now, glowing on the screen in front of him. Hattie Monroe, the kindest stranger he had ever met. The old woman who had rebuilt his bike in the dark and asked for nothing back but that he go and be kind to someone else. His father's stubborn woman, the bravest person his father ever knew, sitting down quiet in a fire all over again. And this time Dawson Armstrong was the one standing there with a hand free. He did not move fast on it even then, because he was a reporter before he was anything else, and a reporter learns to distrust the story he most wants to be true. He spent the first 2 of those 8 days doing nothing but checking, because he had been wrong before about men like Holden, wrong in the direction of believing too quickly in a story that fell apart, helped no one, and got an old woman's hopes up only to drop them. He pulled the original complaint and read it 3 times and found, buried in the routing, the same office and the same hand that had filed the false complaints in the other 3 counties he had spent 8 months documenting. He pulled the tax records and the auction history and laid Holden's purchases out on a map on his wall with pins and string until the pattern was so plain that a child could have read it, the condemnations and the auctions following the complaints like crows following a plow. Only when he was certain of the way you have to be, certain before you put a thing in print, did he let himself feel the rest of it, the part that had nothing to do with the story and everything to do with the photograph in his desk drawer. Then he sat for a long time in the dark of his apartment, not writing, just sitting, because a thing his father had taught him was pulling against a thing his profession had taught him, and the two of them do not always agree. His profession said, observe, document, report, do not become part of the story you are telling. Keep your hands clean of it so the reader can trust you. But his father had not made him promise to observe anybody. His father had made him promise to help. And Dawson understood, sitting there in the dark, that there was a kind of clean that was really only cowardice, wearing a necktie, a way of standing back with your notebook, while a thing happened that you had it in your power to stop, and telling yourself that the standing back was integrity. His father had run up a burning stair. His father had not stood at the bottom of it taking notes. So Dawson decided somewhere in the small hours to do both, to report it true and to be in it anyway. To ride down himself and stand in that lot and let the chips fall. And if his editor did not like it, she could take his byline off it, but he was going. He made the first call before the sun was up. He did not sleep that night, or the next, or most of the nights after, and he did not much care because for the first time in 2 years, the noise of the engine had gone quiet inside his head on its own, without his having to ride 300 miles to drown it, and he understood why. And the understanding of it kept him going better than sleep could have. He was finally doing the one thing his father had asked of him with his last good Christmas. He was finally getting a chance to be the kind of person his father had spent a lifetime insisting some stubborn woman already was. What happened over the next 8 days, Hattie knew nothing about, none of it. She kept her shop. She swept her floor. She slept badly when she slept at all, and woke before the alarm in the dark, and stood in the bay doorway at first light, looking down the empty road at nothing. But 200 miles south, and then closer still, a thing was building that no county form and no clean soft hand was going to stop. Because it ran on the one single fuel that the men with the paperwork never learned to put on their ledgers, never figure into their patient calculations, which is that ordinary people remember a kindness done to them when they had nothing. Remember it for years, remember it for a lifetime, and that they will ride a very long way when the day comes to pay it back. Dawson made calls. He called the riders he had come up around, the men and women who had taught him the road, and they called the clubs and the chapters they knew, and the story moved out from him the way it had already begun. Moving up through the valley, except that now it had a name and a face and a date on the calendar, and a man in a quarter-zip pullover to push back against. He called the retired structural engineer who had grown up on Route 9, the same gray-haired man who had stood in Hattie's Bay and shaken his head, and the engineer said before Dawson had even finished asking that he would do the full assessment for nothing on his own license and submit his findings in writing directly to the county inspector, and that he would be standing in that lot with his laser level and his clipboard at first light on the morning of the inspection, if the Lord let him wake up. Dawson started a petition, and it was signed in the end by 614 people across 3 counties, people who had themselves been on the wrong end of Gary Holden, or who knew someone who had, or who had simply read the few lines about it in the small valley paper and could not stand it. And Dawson called his editor at the regional paper a hard woman, not given to sentiment of any kind, and he told her he had finally found the human face the whole 8-month investigation had been missing. The face that would make a reader who did not care about zoning law sit up and care about this. He told her the whole of it, the fire in the mill and the wrong turn and his father's promise and the bike in the rain and the name on the screen, and his editor, who had heard 10,000 stories and learned to keep her voice flat through all of them, was quiet on the line for a long moment, and then she said, "Run it the day after the inspection, not before we do this clean." And then she said, "And Dawson, be there yourself, for the love of God, do not file this one from your desk." On the 13th day, the day before the inspection, Hattie pulled the last of the personal boxes to the door. She had her wrenches, which were hers, and not the building's, packed in a wooden crate. She had the 3 trophies and the cracked gloves wrapped in a towel. She had the 2 photographs, which she would carry in her own hands. She had the lopsided green mug, and Gage's mother's Bible, and the framed school portraits. And she had a clean button-down shirt laid out across Gage's chair in the house, and her one good pair of pants pressed and hung, and her work boots set out by the door to be polished. And she could not have told you, if you had asked her straight, why on earth she meant to dress up fine for the morning. She lost everything she had, except that her own mother had raised her in a hard house, in a hard town to meet the worst things in life, with her collar buttoned and her boots clean. On the grounds that the world would take everything else from you it could reach, but it could not make you meet it sloppy. She thought about Gage a good deal that last night, sitting at the kitchen table with the boot polish and the rag. She thought about how he would have handled all of it, and she knew because she had known the man for 30 years that he would have handled it badly, that he would have lost his temper, that he would have gone down to the valley and said something to somebody he should not have said, and made it all worse because Gage led with his heart, and his heart was a hot one. It had fallen to her in their marriage to be the cold and steady one, the one who read the bills and made the hard calls and kept the calm where it lived. She had not minded it. She had loved him for the heat exactly as much as she had carried him for it. And she found herself wishing, polishing the second boot, that he were there to be handled, that she had a hot-tempered fool of a husband to talk down off the ceiling one more time. Because the talking down had been a kind of love, and she had not known while she had it that it was the whole of her, that the steadiness only meant anything, because there was someone there who needed her to be steady. Alone, the steadiness was just a habit. She wiped the polish into the leather and thought, "You stubborn, soft-hearted man, you went and left me to be calm all by myself with nobody to be calm at, and that is the cruelest thing you ever did to me, and you did not even mean it." And then she laughed a little alone in the kitchen at the cold stove, because that was the truth and there was no one left to argue it with, and the laugh was wet at the edges, but it was a laugh, and she finished the boot. She locked up that night the 3 tries on the bent hinge, and she stood a long moment in the dark lot looking back at the building. The crooked bay door, the faded sign Gage had hand-lettered Monroe's garage, the paint flaking now, the tin roof that leaked in 3 places and always would, 50 years of one life and a marriage and a man's grave a mile down the road under the maples. And tomorrow a stranger with a clipboard would walk through it all and check his little boxes and hand her a sentence wrapped in blue-sealed letterhead. And the day after that, the surveyors would come for the chrome and the craft beer and the gift shop. "Well, old man," she said quietly out into the dark to Gage, the way she still did some nights standing in the lot, "I held it just as long as I could. You will have to forgive me the rest." She did not know that 200 miles south, 67 motorcycles were being fueled in the dark for a ride that would begin hours before the dawn. She did not know that a young man with his dead father's jaw and his dead father's easy stance was at that moment loading a creased photograph into the inside pocket of a torn riding jacket and lying down to not sleep either. She did not know that the ledger she had written in 3 weeks back, with a used chain and a kind word, and 4 forgotten sentences, was about to come due all at once, in a sound she would feel in her teeth and her sternum and the fillings of her back molars long before she ever understood what it was she was hearing. She went into the house. She sat at the kitchen table under the one good light, and she polished her boots, both of them slow and even, the way her mother had shown her until they held a dull shine. Then she lay down on top of the covers in her clothes, and she listened to the creek run behind the house, and at some point in the deepest part of the night she slept, and she did not dream, and out in the dark the whole world went on quietly arranging itself in her favor while she rested. The way it almost never does for anybody. The way it does just often enough, just barely often enough, that people keep on telling stories like this one to one another in the dark to remember that it can. 300 miles to the south, while Hattie slept her dreamless sleep, the lot of a closed truck stop filled up in the dark headlight. By headlight, the way a creek bed fills in a slow rain. They came in 2s and 3s and then in larger knots. Riders who had heard the story at a counter or a campfire or off a phone passed hand-to-hand riders who did not know Hattie Monroe from any other old woman in any other county, but who knew the shape of what was being done to her, because most of them had watched it done to someone, a parent, a neighbor themselves. Nobody had organized them in any way that would show on paper. There was no club behind it, no president, no patch. There was just a young man who had made some calls and a story that had done the rest, in the simple fact, which the men with the paperwork never account for, that a great many people are only waiting for a clear chance to be on the right side of something, and will cross 3 states overnight to take it when it comes. They fueled in the dark and checked one another's tires and shared coffee out of dented thermoses, and a little before 3 in the morning, a gray-bearded man nobody had appointed climbed up on a curb and said in a voice that did not need to be loud, that they would ride easy and ride together, and that nobody was to so much as raise a voice in that lot when they got there. That they were not going up that holler to frighten anybody. They were going up to stand, and that there was a difference, and the difference was the whole point, and every man and woman there was to remember it. Then they pulled their helmets down, and the sound of 67 engines turning over at once rolled out across the empty dark like the first low note of something enormous, and the long staggered line of them swung out onto the highway under the stars and pointed itself north. Toward the mountains, toward the dead road, toward an old woman polishing her boots for the morning she believed she was going to lose. They rode through the dark with their lights burning up out of the flatland and into the climbing curves, and the dawn came up gray and then pink ahead of them and to their right. And not one of them turned back, and the holler, when they finally came down into it around the south bend, was holding its breath. On the morning of the inspection, Hattie Monroe was standing outside her garage in the first gray light before the sun had come up over the eastern ridge. She had put on the clean button-down shirt. She had pressed her one good pair of pants and combed her gray hair straight back off her face and polished her boots the night before until they held that dull shine, and she stood in them now on the cracked concrete at the lip of the bay. She did not know why she had done any of it. Nobody was coming to see her, not really, not in the way that you dress for. The inspector would walk through and check his boxes and hand her the end of her life on a county form, and that would be that 50 years gone because a rich man wanted the dirt under an old woman's feet and had the patience and the lawyers to take it one signature at a time. The boxes were stacked by the door behind her in the dim shop. The two photographs were propped against the register. The sun was not up over the ridge yet, and the holler held that cold blue, breathless stillness it holds in the hour before the light comes down into the bottom of it. The creek loud in the quiet, a single crow calling once far back in the dark pines and then going still. Then she heard it. A low rumble far off at first, the way thunder rolls in from over the next county. Except the sky above the eastern ridge was already going pink and then gold and clear, not a single cloud in any direction, not a hint of weather. Hattie turned her head toward the sound, frowning. It grew. It deepened and thickened and grew. The ground under her polished boots began faintly at first and then unmistakably to vibrate. And she felt the tremor of it come up through the soles of her feet and into her knees and settle low in her chest, and for a moment she did not understand it at all. And then she understood it all at once, and her breath caught hard in her throat. She looked down Route 9 toward the south bend, where the dead road curved out of sight between two stands of dark pine, and what came around that bend out of the gold morning haze stopped her heart still in her chest. Motorcycles, dozens of them. Headlights still burning in the early light in a long staggered formation that came around the curve and kept coming, more of them and more, the line of them stretching back out of sight around the bend. 40, 50, more than that. They were slowing as they came on, all of them, the whole long line dropping down through the gears in a rolling growl. And one after another they swung off the road and rolled into the gravel lot in front of Hattie's garage until the lot was full of them, and they kept arriving and began to fill the shoulder both directions up and down the road. 67 of them, though nobody thought to count until much later. The sound was enormous. 67 engines settling to an idle rumbling and popping and filling the whole bottom of the holler with a vibration you could feel in your teeth and your breastbone, a vast living thing of sound that bounced off the ridges and rolled back. The riders came down off the bikes one at a time, and all ages, all kinds, men and women, gray beards and young ones with bright eyes, hard leather and soft denim, and a few in plain flannel work shirts no different from Hattie's own, kicking down their stands, pulling off their helmets, tucking their gloves under their arms. And not one of them said a word to her, not yet. They simply gathered quiet under the great idling rumble of the machines and turned to face the bay and waited. Behind them, two white vans pulled up onto the shoulder, and the side doors slid open, and people climbed out carrying cameras and long boom microphones in gray foam and folding silver light reflectors. A woman with a press badge clipped to her jacket lifted a handheld and tested it against the noise. A man set the three legs of a tripod down into the gravel and leveled it. A red light came on, and another. And at the front of all of it, walking toward her across the crowded lot, pulling a black helmet up and off his head, was Dawson Armstrong. Hattie did not move. Her boots stayed planted on the cracked concrete at the lip of the bay, where she had stood every morning at dawn for the better part of 50 years, and she watched him come, this thin young man she had met one rainy night and never thought to see again, and her hand came up slow and pressed flat against her own chest over her heart, as if to hold it still. Dawson came up close to her, and he was carrying a manila folder under his arm. His jaw was set the way it had been set in the rain 3 weeks back, except now there was something else moving under it, and his eyes were bright and unsteady and would not quite settle on her face. "I told you," he said, and his voice came out thick and broke a little around the edges. "I told you I would help somebody when they needed it." He swallowed. "Turns out you are the somebody." He held the folder out to her. Hattie's hands were not entirely steady when she took it, and she stepped back into the bay and opened it flat on top of the workbench Gage had built that first winter, in the better light, and she put her glasses on and she read. The first page was a printed receipt from the county tax office. Her back property taxes, all $1,400 of them paid in full, the receipt dated 2 days before the payer's name, a thing she would have to ask about later, because right then her eyes would not hold on it. The second page was a letter on the heavy letterhead of a licensed structural engineering firm, signed by the gray-haired man who had stood in her bay and run his hand along her cinder block and shaken his head and driven away. It offered to perform a complete structural assessment of the building at no cost and to submit the findings directly to the county inspector's office. And below his signature in his own square hand he had written, "Already done, came out before dawn, with my key man. She is sound as a dollar. The footings are better than half the new construction in this county. See the attached, and somebody tell that old woman her courses are plumb." The third page and the fourth and the fifth and on were the petition, 614 names with addresses in 3 counties worth of different hands, ballpoint and pencil, and one in what looked like a child's careful crayon, all of them formally opposing the Holden development and formally requesting that the state attorney general open a review into the company's land acquisition practices. Hattie closed the folder. Her hands were steady now. It was her voice that was not. "How?" she said. "How did you do all of this?" "I am a reporter," Dawson said. "Investigative. I have been working a story on Gary Holden for 8 months on my own time mostly. He has run this same scheme on people up and down this whole part of the state. He buys the county's people files, false complaints against the buildings, gets them condemned, then buys the land for the back taxes after he has driven folks off it for pennies on the dollar. The night I went down on your road in the rain, I was not just passing through Mrs. Monroe. I was riding to Augusta to interview another one of his targets, an old man who lost his farm to the exact same trick." Hattie looked at him. "You did not mean to stop here," she said slowly, "that night." "No, ma'am, I did not. That was the storm. That was a wet curve and bad luck and nothing else." He stopped and his eyes finally came up and held on her face. "But when you rebuilt my bike in the dark and would not take $1 off me and told me to go help somebody, I went home and I could not let it go, so I looked you up. And that was how I found out what Holden was doing to you, your name sitting right there in the middle of his list." He stopped again, longer this time. "And then I found something else, something I was not looking for at all." He reached into the inside pocket of the torn riding jacket, the same jacket she had handed him a shop towel through, and he took out a photograph. Old. Creased straight down the middle from 40 years folded in a wallet. Soft and gray at every edge. He held it out to her, and his own hand was shaking now too, as badly as hers had shaken at the counter that night. Hattie took it. And the lot, and the 67 idling engines, and the cameras, and the red lights, and the gold morning coming down over the ridge, all of it went silent and far away, as if the whole world had stepped back to give the two of them room. It was the same photograph, the exact same one, the same one that stood propped against her cash register 6 feet behind her at that very moment. 2 people in front of a burned-out mill. A man with a scorched arm and an impossible grin, holding up a soot-streaked young woman who could barely stand. "Donnie Armstrong was my father," Dawson said. Hattie's hands began to shake so hard the old photograph trembled and rattled faintly, and she pressed it flat against her chest with both palms over her heart, exactly the way she had pressed its twin on the worst night of her life, and she held it there, and she looked up into the young man's face. The thin jaw, the way he stood with his weight carried just slightly forward, ready, easy. The way he tipped his head a small degree to the right when he was waiting for you to answer him. All of it was Dante. Every bit of it had been Dante 40 years gone, grinning in a parking lot in the hard October light with a dying woman held up under his arm. Your father, Hattie said, and her voice broke clean across the middle of the word. Your father saved my life. He carried me out of that fire. He burned his own arm to the bone, holding a door for me, and I have never in 40 years, She had to stop and breathe. I tried to thank him. He would not let me. He said I would have done the same for him. And I have spent 40 years not knowing if that was ever once true about me, wondering if he was just a kind man being kind. He told me about you every year of my life, Dawson said. Every October on the day. The whole of it. The boiler, the smoke, the wrong turn you took into the records room. The way you had sat down on the floor today rather than call out and ask anybody for help. A laugh came up out of him, wet and cracked. He said you were the bravest person he ever knew, and the stubbornness both on account of that. And before he died 2 years back, he made me promise him a thing. He held my hand too hard, and he made me promise that if I ever in my life came across somebody too stubborn to ask for the help they plainly needed, I would help them anyway, no matter what it cost me. He said he had learned that a long time ago from somebody. He never told me it was you. He never said your name. Not once in my whole life. I think he held it too close. I think it would have cost him too much to say out loud, so he never said it, and I never knew. Until I typed it into a county computer 8 days ago and could not breathe. Hattie laughed then too. It came up out of her rough and cracked and almost soundless, like an engine that has sat dead through a long, hard winter and turns over anyway against all reason on the third cold try and catches and runs. For a moment, neither of them could say anything more, and neither of them needed to. Hattie reached out with one hand, the photograph still pressed to her chest with the other, and she put her grease-roughened palm against the side of the young man's face, the jaw that was his father's jaw. And she held it there, and he leaned the smallest amount into her hand, the way a person leans into a thing they did not know they had been starving for. And the two of them stood like that in the bay door with 67 engines idling at their backs. Out in the lot, the gray-bearded man who had stood on the curb in the dark 3 states away took off his helmet, and then slow one at a time, all down the long line of them, the rest of the riders did the same. 67 helmets coming off in the gold morning, not because anyone had told them to, but because there are moments a person knows to bare his head for without being taught. And this was one, and they all of them knew it at once. The woman with the press badge lowered her microphone. The man behind the tripod stepped back from the camera and let it run on its own and just watched like the rest of them, like everyone. Nobody spoke. The creek ran on behind the building, and Hattie Monroe, who had spent 40 years certain that the saving of her had been a debt and a shame, understood at last, with her hand on the dead man's living son's face, that it had never been a debt at all. It had been a gift, freely given the way she had given the boy his bike back on a wet night, the way the 67 had given up a night's sleep in 3 states of road, and that the only thing a gift like that ever asks of you, the only thing it ever asked of her, was that you let it be a gift, that you stop being ashamed of having been worth saving and pass the saving on. She had spent 40 years refusing the gift out of pride. She took it now, finally in the gold light, and it cost her everything that pride was worth, which turned out to be nothing at all and was worth more than anything she had ever owned. The 67 riders stood in the gravel and watched, and not one of them made a single sound under the rumble of their machines. The cameras kept rolling the red lights steady and unblinking. The crows stayed quiet in the pines, and an old woman stood in the doorway of the garage she had built with her own 2 hands, with her dead friend's photograph pressed over her heart and her dead friend's living son standing in front of her in the gold light, and she understood. In the way that a person comes to understand the very largest things all at once, and far too late, and exactly and perfectly on time, that the debt she had carried like a stone in her chest for 40 years had never once been hers alone to pay. It had been a circle the whole long while. It had only ever been waiting patient as money, but kinder, for the last arc of it to close. You came back, she said. You fixed my bike for nothing in the middle of the night in the rain, Dawson said. And you told me the only thing you were charging was that I go help somebody when they needed it. His voice steadied at last, and he looked at her straight and did not look away. I am just paying the bill, ma'am. That is all this is. I am just doing the one thing you told me to do. The county building inspector arrived 20 minutes later. He came up the lot in a white county truck and he had to slow to a crawl, and then he had to stop the truck altogether at the edge of the gravel because 67 motorcycles filled the lot and lined the road in both directions as far as he could see, and 3 news cameras stood on their tripods pointed at the open bay. And a licensed structural engineer with gray hair was already inside the building taking measurements off the cinder block with a laser level that threw a thin red line up the wall, and 614 signatures sat in a manila folder on the workbench beside a tax receipt stamped paid. The inspector was not, as it turned out, a bad man. He was a tired man in late middle age who had been handed a complaint and a date and a folder, and who had not asked who had filed the complaint because asking was nowhere in his job description, and asking in that county was a fine way to find yourself reassigned. He got out of the truck slow and stood beside it a moment, taking in the crowd, the cameras, the engineer's red line crawling up the wall, the old woman in the clean shirt standing in the bay with a young man beside her, and something moved across his tired face, and he understood the same way the man in the polo shirt had understood with the animal part of himself that the situation in front of him had a weight to it now that had not been anywhere in the paperwork on his clipboard. He did the inspection. He did it properly, which was the one thing he had it in him to do. It took the better part of an hour. He went over the whole building with the engineer's written report in one hand and his own county form on the clipboard in the other, walking the wiring, sighting down the roof line, kneeling at the footings, and the cameras stayed back and the crowd stayed quiet and let the man work. Hattie stood in the bay with Dawson beside her and did not say a word the entire time, because Samuel Ford had taught her a lifetime ago that there is a kind of fight you win by being perfectly still and letting the truth land its own punches. He found 3 violations: a fire extinguisher with an inspection tag a year out of date, a single cracked pane of glass in the little office window, an expired sticker on the cover of the electrical panel. All 3 of them fixable in a single afternoon with one trip to the hardware store down in the valley and $20. He did not condemn the building. He wrote it all up on the form slow and careful, and he had Hattie sign at the bottom, and the box he marked was the one that said the structure was fundamentally sound and the deficiencies minor and correctable, and he tore off the carbon copy and handed it to her. Then he held out his hand and Hattie shook it, and he leaned in close so that the cameras and their long microphones would not catch it. And he said low, "Just for her, ma'am, between you and me, and nobody else. I am glad it came out this way. I have signed a few of these I am not proud of." And then he straightened up and he walked back to his white truck without once looking at the cameras or saying a word to the press. And he drove off slow down the dead road through the lane that the writers opened up for him without being asked. Gary Holden's lawyer telephoned that same afternoon. The conversation lasted 45 seconds, and Hattie did most of the listening, and at the end of it, she said no thank you, the way she had said it the very first time, and hung up the receiver, and that was the last she ever heard from Holden Development directly. Dawson's story ran in the regional paper 2 days later, the way his editor had ordered it clean the day after and not the day before. The fire in the mill and the wrong turn into the records room, the bike that went down in the rain on the dead road, the hand-filed brake lever, the 4 words, the 67 riders coming around the South Bend out of the gold haze, the photograph creased straight down the middle, and its twin propped against an old woman's cash register. 40 years and 300 miles apart, finally hung side by side on the same wall. The story was picked up off the wire within the week and ran in papers all across the state and then well past it. And within 10 days, the Office of the State Attorney General announced that it was opening a formal investigation into Holden Development's land acquisition practices across 4 counties. Gary Holden pulled his bid on the whole south stretch of Route 9 before the month was out. 2 of his associates were indicted the following spring on charges of bribing county officials and filing false complaints, and the resort, the Chrome, and the craft beer and the gift shop selling bandanas made overseas was never built. Not one footing of it poured. The south stretch of the holler stayed exactly what it had always been, which was a quiet place at the bottom of a dead road, where the creek ran loud in the spring and clear in the fall, and where an old woman fixed engines off a road nobody drove. But that is not the part of the story that matters most. That is only the part with the villain in it, and the villain in any story worth telling all the way through is always the very least interesting thing in it, no matter how much room he takes up while he is on his feet. What mattered was what happened after the cameras packed their tripods back into the white vans and drove away up the road. After the riders fired their engines back up one by one, 67 of them, and pulled out onto Route 9 in a long, rolling growl, each one lifting a hand to the old woman in the bay door as they passed, the sound of them rolling away down the holler for a full 10 minutes until the last of it faded out behind the south bend and the creek was loud again. After Dawson Armstrong shook her hand one final time and then thought better of the handshake and put his arms around her instead, this small old woman his father had carried out of a fire before he was ever born, and held on to her for a moment, and then let go and pulled his helmet down and rode away on the bike she had rebuilt in the dark. What mattered was that Hattie Monroe walked back into her garage alone in the new quiet with the engine still ringing faintly in her ears, and stood in the middle of the bay for a long minute, and then went to the very back and pulled the dusty cardboard box out from under the workbench one final time, and carried it up to the counter and set it under the fluorescent light. She took out the 3 brass trophies, the fighters with their fists up, and she did not put them back in the box. She set them in a row on the high shelf above the cash register, where the morning light from the bay door would find them, where every soul who ever walked into that shop would see them and wonder. She took the photograph of herself and Samuel Ford Young and grinning outside the low brick gym, and she hung it on the wall beside the old clock that had hung there since Gage's time. And she took the photograph of herself and Dante Armstrong, the one from the bottom of the box, and she pinned it right up beside the one Dawson had given back into her hands that morning, so that the two of them hung there together at last, the same single moment from 2 different wallets. 40 years apart, 300 miles apart, finally come all the way home to rest on the same wall. For 40 years, Hattie had hidden every piece of who she used to be. The fighter, the one with the calmest hands Samuel Ford ever taught. The survivor, the young woman who had sat down on a cold floor in a burning building and let a near stranger burn his own arm to the bone carrying her out, and who had spent the whole rest of her life so deeply secretly ashamed of having needed that, of having been the one who was sad instead of the one who did the saving, that she had buried the entire woman under engine grease and morning routine and 40 years of silence. She had treated her own past like a room you lock and never enter again, and throw away the key and learn to walk past in the dark without looking at the door. And maybe that worked for a while. Maybe the silence was the only thing that kept her standing in the years when standing was all she had it in her to do. But hiding does not heal a single thing. It only puts distance between you and the thing that needs facing, and distance is not the same as peace. Though the two of them can feel very much alike in the dark of a long night, alike enough to fool a person for 40 years. Donnie Armstrong carried Hattie Monroe out of a fire when she was 26 years old and asked nothing of her but that she be the kind of person he already believed her to be. 40 years later, on a rainy night on a road that nobody drove anymore, Hattie rebuilt Dante Armstrong's son's motorcycle from the frame up and asked nothing of him but that he carry the kindness on to a stranger. And he carried it, not over his shoulder the way his father had carried her through the smoke. He carried her out of a different kind of fire, a slower one with a manila folder full of paper, a photograph creased down the middle, 614 signatures, and a promise made to a dying man across a kitchen table one last Christmas. The shape of it was different. The thing itself was exactly the same. It had only changed hands. Hattie kept the garage open. She never got rich off of it, and getting rich had never once been what it was for. The news story faded the way that news stories always fade, replaced by the next thing, and the next thing after that, the world's attention moving on the way a river moves on past a stone. But something on Route 9 had changed for good, and it did not fade. Riders started coming through again. Not a flood of them, never that. A trickle at first, and then a steady, dependable thing, a thread of engine noise woven back into the quiet of the holler. Word had gotten around in the riding community, the real one, the one that does not trailer its machines, that there was an old woman with a garage off the new highway who would fix your bike at a fair price and do honest work and never once cheat you, and who had a story behind her if you were the kind to earn the hearing of it. Some of them came because they had read the piece in the paper. Some came because somebody had told it around a campfire at a rally 3 states away, the way the good stories travel. There was one of them she remembered better than the rest, though she could not have told you his name. He came through the following summer alone, a man past 60 on a road-worn machine, and he did not need a thing fixed. He stood in the bay with his helmet under his arm and looked at the two photographs on the wall and the three brass fighters on the shelf for a long while. And then he told her quietly, not quite looking at her, that he had been one of the 67. That he had ridden up that morning from 2 states over because a man at a fuel stop had told him the story and he had not been able to get it out of his head. He said he had lost his own place years back, a little welding shop, to a man not so different from Holden, and that he had not fought, it had not known how, had taken the check and hated himself for it ever since. He said standing in that lot on that gold morning and watching it come out the other way, the right way, just once, had done something for him that he did not have the words for, had set down a weight he had carried for a long time. He said he had not come to get anything fixed. He had just wanted to see that the place was still here, still open, still hers. Then he put his helmet back on and rode off, and Hattie stood in the bay door and watched him go. And she understood that the thing Dawson had set rolling that morning had not stopped when the cameras left, that it was still rolling out there, through people she would never meet, setting down weights she would never know the size of. That was the part the news story never caught, because there is no way to photograph it. A kindness does not end where you can see it ending. It only goes underground for a while, like the water, and comes up somewhere else and somebody else years on, and you almost never get to watch it surface. She had been given the rare gift of watching it surface once on a gold morning, and she carried that gift quietly for the rest of her life, and it changed the way she looked at every stranger who ever rolled into her lot after. And some came for no reason at all, but that the road happened to carry them down into the bottom of the holler one evening, and there was a light burning in the bay. Hattie never once asked which kind they were. She just opened the doors at 6 and swept the floor and lined the wrenches up by size and waited. Only now, when somebody walked into her bay, she did not look past them at the empty road behind them the way she had for 11 lonely years. She looked at them, at their face, at the hands they held out, and the way they stood. Because that is the one thing you finally learn if you are given long enough to live and you pay close enough attention. You never know who is standing in front of you. You never know whose son just rolled into your gravel lot on a busted bike in the rain. You never know what a single plain act of ordinary kindness asked of nobody and given freely for nothing at all will set rolling toward you slow and certain down the long years you cannot see the end of. Hattie Monroe rebuilt a stranger's motorcycle on a wet night because it was the thing in front of her that needed doing, and the young man on the stool needed it done, and there was nobody else on the dead road to do it. That is the whole of it. That is the entire secret start to finish, and there is no trick hidden inside of it anywhere. No fine print, no catch. You do the thing that needs doing. You do not ask for anything back. And you trust. Against the whole weight of the evidence and against everything the hard world has tried to teach you, that somewhere out past where your own eyes can reach the world is keeping a ledger in a hand you will never read, and that it balances in the end more often than the cynics will ever once admit out loud. Dawson came by twice a year after that every year. He always rode his father's bike, the one Hattie had rebuilt in the dark, and he always showed up without calling ahead the way his father used to do everything that mattered. He would roll into the gravel lot, and Hattie would look up from whatever she had up on the lift, and she would hand him a clean rag and point him at something that needed wiping down, and he would shrug out of his jacket and roll up his sleeves and get to it. They did not talk a great deal. They did not need to. Some bonds in this world are not built out of conversation at all. They are built out of showing up year after year on a road that nobody else drives and being there, and that is enough and more than enough. Hattie understood that now all the way through. She had understood it her whole life, somewhere down underneath the grease and the silence. She had just let herself forget it for one long, cold stretch of years, the way a person can forget the most important thing they know. The garage on Route 9 stayed open for 11 more years. Hattie Monroe died at 82 on a Saturday afternoon in the early fall, sitting on her stool in the bay with a socket wrench in her right hand and the radio playing low in the corner and the creek running clear behind the building the way it always had, the way it always would. She had finished a brake job that very morning for a young couple passing through and waved off half the price because the girl was expecting, and they had thanked her and ridden on. And she had sat down on the stool to rest a minute in the gold afternoon light, and she had not gotten up. Her grandchildren flew in from Oregon, and her son with them gray at the temples, now himself. And so did Dawson Armstrong on his father's bike, 300 miles in one long, hard day, riding through the night to make it. Dawson wrote the obituary because he was the one who knew how to write, and because she would not have stood for anybody making a fuss. It ran in 2 papers, and it was 3 lines long, because 3 lines were all she would have allowed, and because 3 lines were all that the truth of it ever needed. Hattie Monroe, mechanic, she helped people. That was enough. That was everything.